Hello, my name is Mr. Lauder and I'm going to take you through a higher PE supported study revision resource. This video will focus on developing your understanding of the command words that are used within higher PE to allow you to become more confident when answering a question in higher PE. So by the end of this video and by engaging with this session, I hope that you'll be able to identify the command word that is within a question and select the appropriate answer structure to use to answer the question. You'll also be able to apply your understanding of the answer structures to answer a range of higher PE questions. During this video, you'll see these two symbols throughout the video. The tick indicates that you are having to correct your own work that you do, and the pause sign is asking you to pause the video to complete a task or answer a question. To complete this lesson, you will need access to a notepad, a jotter, or a document that you can type on your computer to answer the questions that are in the lesson. So what are the command words? Well, I'm sure you're well aware of the command words, as I'm sure throughout the year they've been getting hammered home to you and how important they are. So the command word will be included within each question and will dictate how you should answer that question. So it's important you know exactly what is expected of you when you face any of the command words within the higher PE exam. You may get asked to identify. You could get asked to describe. You may get asked to explain, analyse, or evaluate. Now, understanding how to answer each command word is the key to accessing marks within the exam. If you don't understand how to answer a particular question or a particular command word, you're potentially closing the door to being able to access those marks in the exam. So the first command word that we're going to look at is identify. Now, identify, if you're asked to identify something, all you're being asked to do is name it. Just name it. You don't have to go into any detail. You don't have to write loads of sentences. You just have to name whatever you have been asked to identify. Unfortunately, identify questions will be few and far between in the exam, but if they do come up, you need to make sure that you're ready to pick up those marks. This is the first task I would like you to complete. I'd like you to answer these 4 questions. Question 1, identify 2 methods of data collection for each of the 4 factors. Question 2, identify 2 types of data that may be collected. Question 3, identify 2 training approaches for each of the 4 factors. And question 4, identify 2 types of feedback. So I'd like you to pause the video just now, write your answer to those questions, and once you've finished answering the questions, start playing the video again and some of the answers will come up. So on this table here is answers to some of the questions that were asked. Now, the methods of data collection and the training approaches that are listed on the screen just now are not completely exhaustive, and there may be a method of data collection that you have used or a training approach that you have used that is not on this list. The best way to check that would be going on to the SQA website and having a look at the 4 factors table and just making sure that the method or the training approach that you have said is included within the 4 factors table. But hopefully there's a range of different methods there that might cover the ones that you have used or that you have identified for this question. For question 2, identify the 2 types of data that may be collected. So that's qualitative and quantitative. Now you might not get specifically asked that question in the actual exam, but you may have to use your knowledge of qualitative and quantitative data to answer other types of questions. There are some past paper questions from the 2019 paper that do require you to have that understanding of qualitative and quantitative data and know the difference between them both. Just to touch on that quickly, so qualitative data, do you know what that means? Qualitative, it's the information that is more subjective. It's more based on opinion, whereas quantitative is stats, it's figures, it's numbers. The way that I would often remember it is in the quantitative, it suggests like quantity being a number of something. So that's one way to potentially remember quantitative. And qualitative is obviously the opposite of that. Identify 2 training approaches for each of the 4 factors. Again, there's a range there. You may have used some approaches that are not on that list. So as I said, check the 4 factors table just to make sure that you're right. And then for question 4, identify 2 types of feedback. Hopefully you have identified 2 of the types of feedback that are on that sheet. So check your answers. Make sure you correct any that you're unsure about, or do a little bit of further research on any that you've not quite got right. The second command word that we're going to look at today is describe. So when you're asked to describe something, effectively what you're doing is you're painting a picture using words to create a description of what you've been asked to describe. So going away from higher PE content for a minute, what I'd like you to do is take 1 minute to write a description of your journey to school as if you were to describe to someone who has never done this journey before. So I'd like you to pause the video, give yourself 1 minute, set a timer, and write a description of your journey to school. Pause the video now. So when you look at your description, hopefully you have got lots of detail in your description. And potentially these are some of the things that you will have mentioned. You might mention who. Who is involved in your journey to school? What? What do you have to do? What does it look like at each stage? So, what is it you actually do to get to school? Where do you go? Whereabouts is your journey happening? When? When does each part of the journey happen? So for example, if you have to walk a certain bit, then you get the bus, then you've got to walk again. So when does each part happen? And how? How do you complete your journey? How do you go about doing it? So this who, what, where, when and how is the details that are required when you are describing something within higher PE. Now you're not going to be asked in the exam to describe your journey to school. But when you are asked to describe something, this is information you must include. As it says at the bottom there, when answering a describe question, you do not need to say why. So when you're describing that journey to school there, you don't have to tell me why you do something. You don't have to tell me why you get the bus or why you walk. You just have to tell us who's involved, what you do, where you do it, when you do it, and how. So in terms of higher PE, what describe questions could you get asked? Now this is just an example of some questions from past papers. So describe one short-term goal and one long-term goal for emotional factors. You could get asked to describe an approach to develop physical factors or any of the other factors. You could get asked to describe methods, one or multiple, you could use to collect information about the impact of emotional factors on performance. Again, that question could relate to any factor. You could get asked to describe the impact of mental factors on performance. You could get asked to describe the adaptations or changes that may need to be made to a performance development plan for physical factors. This is just a sample of some of the questions that you could get asked that relate to describe. For you to be able to answer describe questions well, this video would go on for hours if we were to go through how to describe absolutely everything. So what you need to do is you need to make sure that you have got a sound and deep knowledge and understanding of the different areas of content that you may get asked to describe. When someone reads your description, they should have a clear understanding of what it is that you're talking about. So if you're talking about a method of data collection, if you're talking about a training approach and you're describing it, someone should be able to go ahead and carry that out based on your description. A good test for you to do would be to speak to a family member, a friend, someone that you know that potentially doesn't do higher PE, and describe something to them. For example, describe a training approach that you have used. Describe a method of data collection that you have used. Does the person that you're describing it to, are they able to understand what it is you're talking about? Because if they do, then I would suggest that you are including good level of detail in your answer. We're now going to move on to look at explain. Now, explain questions, there's two types of explain questions. You may get asked to explain the impact of a factor on performance. And if you did get asked to do that, you'd be using the FCI answer structure. So FCI stands for factor, context, impact. For you to get 1 mark, you would have to make sure that you use the factor, the context, and you have the factor, the context, and the impact. So if, for example, it's a 4-mark question, you would have to do FCI 4 times. So the factor bit of the answer. This is when you state the sub-factor that you're talking about, and if it's having a positive or a negative effect on the performance. You then go on and give context. So context is basically you giving an example of what that sub-factor would look like in a specific activity. This is also the bit of your answer where you show that you understand the sub-factor you're talking about, and hopefully that will make a bit more sense with the task that we're just about to do. And then you go on and explain what the impact on the performance is. I'd like you to complete this task. I'm going to pause the video in a minute and match each of the sub-factors down the left-hand side to the context description that is on the right-hand side. So each of the sub-factors are numbered 1 to 5. Each of the context and descriptions are lettered A to E. So what description there matches up with motivation? Is it A, B, C, D, or E? For decision making, mental toughness, concentration, and CRE. So pause the video just now and go ahead and do that. Okay, now you can check your answers against what's on the screen. So motivation was number 1, and that matches up with B. During a basketball match, my team were attacking and one of my teammates missed a shot which led to the other team getting the ball. Following the turnover in possession, I worked hard to sprint back into my position within our zone defence. So that idea of sprinting back and working hard makes that link very nicely to motivation. If you didn't talk about that idea of working hard to get back, then I would suggest it's not motivation that you're talking about. Decision making. When playing rugby, I was running forward with the ball and was being supported by my teammate. We were in an attacking 2v1 situation. I decided to run at the defender to engage them before passing to my teammate in space. So it's really clear that you're given an example of a decision that you have made in rugby. So within your context, you have to give an example and show what that sub-factor is you're talking about looks like in sport. Three, mental toughness. During my gymnastics routine, I slipped and fell off the beam. I was able to get straight back on and continue with the rest of my routine without thinking about my mistake. So mental toughness is all about overcoming adversity, overcoming something that's maybe gone wrong. So the fact that this performer slipped and fell off the beam, then they're managing to get back on that, they're overcoming it, they're showing mental toughness. If you've not got that example of something bad happening and then overcoming it, then that wouldn't necessarily be mental toughness. Concentration. Question number 4. When playing netball as goalkeeper, I did not become distracted by the movement of players, and was able to concentrate on the goal shooter in another team and continue to mark them. So that idea of blocking out others, not becoming distracted and focusing on concentrating on what you need to do. And then CRE. While playing football, towards the end of the game, I was able to keep up with the opposition player and put them under pressure as they ran up the pitch. Now, because it's about CRE, the key thing to relate that to or the key part of the context there is about it was towards the end of the game. If you take that bit out about towards the end of the game and just talk about while playing football, I was able to keep up with the opposition player and put them under pressure as they ran up the pitch, that potentially would relate more to speed. But because it's about towards the end of the game, then that links in to CRE. When you're using that FCI answer structure and explaining the impact of a factor on performance, you've got to show that you understand exactly what the factor is that you're talking about. So then how do you then put that into the context of an answer? Well, if the question was to be explain the impact of the mental factor on performance, okay, well obviously because it's an explain question, it's about the impact of a factor, we use the FCI structure. Factor. My high levels of concentration had a positive impact on my performance in netball. Then, I've just taken one from the last table, the context that we've just spoken about. When playing netball as goalkeeper, I did not become distracted by the movement of other players and was able to concentrate on the goal shooter in the other team and continue to mark them. Then you've got to give the impact of that. What happens because you do that? Well, this meant that I made it harder for the goal shooter to receive the ball in the shooting circle, which limited the opportunities the other team had to score. That's the impact of you not being distracted and able to concentrate on the goal shooter. That's the positive impact that it has. So hopefully you can see in this answer there's a clear link with each part of the answer. High levels of concentration, don't become distracted and keep focused on the goal shooter. Positive impact is it's harder for the goal shooter to receive the ball. Factor, context, impact. That's the answer structure, and that's hopefully how it should look when you answer one of those questions. Now for all other explain questions, it's the P-chain answer structure that you would use, PEE. So how that answer structure looks, well, it's point, evidence, explanation. The point in the answer, the first bit, is where you state the point which answers the question that you have been asked. So whatever the question is, you also have to open up your answer with a point that relates to that question. You then need to give a bit of an example that relates, that expands on the point that you have made. And then you'll also then go on and give your explanation. So what I would say is ask yourself, so what? Explain why. And hopefully when we look at some example answers and start writing our own for explain questions, then you will be confident with what that means. So on the bottom of the screen there is a couple of example past paper questions from the 2016-2017 paper that are explain questions, but obviously not explain the impact of a factor. So explain why it is important to monitor progress when developing physical factors which impact on performance, 4 marks, and explain why the methods described in part A, so about the social factors, might be selected. So that question there, that's a kind of follow-on question. So there was a previous question in that 2017 exam that asked candidates to describe methods of data collection with a social factor. Now you're being asked to explain why you selected those methods. So when you're answering questions, it's just important you do check ahead to make sure you know what questions are coming up in case there's going to be a follow-on question. So we're going to focus on this question. Explain why it's important to monitor progress when developing physical factors which impact on performance. So what I'd like you to do is I would like you to pause the video and think of what 4 points could you make when answering this question. So how are you going to start your answer for four times for this question? So pause the video just now and press play again once you've written out your 4 points, and we'll go through some examples. Okay, so hopefully you have managed to get 4 points. You can see if these are any of the ones that you have got. So by monitoring progress when developing physical factors, what does that mean exactly? Well, monitoring progress is that ongoing process throughout the PDP of checking how you're getting on. So how do you go about doing that? Well, potentially you've got a training diary, potentially you've done some retesting, potentially you're gaining feedback maybe from a coach. So why is it important to use and get that information? Well, it allows you to see if your training is actually working. It's going to highlight to you if you have achieved your goal. So you might retest halfway through the PDP and actually realise that you have achieved your goal. It's going to hopefully provide you with some motivation. It will show if your training is at an appropriate level for you. It might highlight to you new areas of development. You might be able to use information to set new goals for the rest of your PDP. And it avoids you wasting time and working on something that's not required. So hopefully you got 4 of those points. If not, you might have managed to get a couple others that aren't already on the screen. So now that you've got your 4 points, we now need to think about how we'd go on and actually write out the answer in full using this P chain. So here's an example of what the P chain would look like. After I've gone through this answer, you can then pause the video and write out your own answer or your own answers. So the point: monitoring progress will avoid you wasting time in training using approaches that are not being effective. So that's a reason as to why it's important to monitor, because it will avoid you wasting time using approaches that are not effective. In your evidence part, you've got to give an example of that, how you go about doing that. So for example, looking back at my training diary, I could see that I was finding continuous running boring and therefore not working hard enough for my heart rate to be in my training zone. That's an example of you being able to monitor how your training's going and what it's going to tell you. Also, in this example, I talked about continuous running. Now, continuous running is a training approach for the physical factor that you would use for developing CRE. Because the question has asked you about when developing physical factors, it's important that you make that link to the physical factors in this question. So please make sure that when you're writing your own answers, that you make those links. Then you give your explanation. And as I said in the previous slide, I said, ask yourself, so what? So what? If you find out that looking at a training diary, you could find out that continuous running was boring and you weren't working hard enough. So what? Why does that matter? Well, the reason that matters is it means that I could make a change to my PDP to use different training approaches that I felt were more enjoyable, which would lead to me making greater improvements to my level of CRE. Because I'm doing ones that I'm going to work harder and complete. And that's the explanation as to why. Using that answer structure and using that example answer, I would like you to go ahead and create 3 answers of your own. It's a 4-mark question, so we've got 1 on the screen just now. I'd like you to go ahead and create 3 more answers. Once you've written out your 3 answers, make sure that you look back at this one and you check to see, have you got the point, the example, and the explanation? Have you got a link to the physical factor? And do you ask yourself, so what? And give that explanation. Pause the video just now, go ahead and answer that question, and then we'll move on to the next command word. So command word 4 is an analyze, or is the analyze command word. And the analyze answer structure is III. And that stands for identify, implication, and impact. So in that identify bit at the start of the answer, that's when you pick the part of what it is you're going to talk about exactly. So depending on what you've been asked to analyse, you'll identify the issue, the information, part of the process, whatever it is that you're going to talk about. You then go on and give the implication. Hopefully this will start to make sense in a little bit. So you give the implication to the performer, the team performance, the method or the approach. What is the implication that it has? And then you finish by explaining the impact. And depending on the question, and if it's asking me to analyse the impact of a factor on performance, when you give that impact, you can link your impact to a different factor. So it's an opportunity to show that you can make those connections. And the impact could be positive or negative. So again, let's take this out with the context of higher PE. We've all been affected by COVID-19, and it's had an impact on everyone's life over the past couple of years. So if we were to analyse the impact that COVID has had on people's life, then if we think about it through this III structure, so if we identify something about COVID, well, initially if you tested positive for COVID, you still do have to isolate for 10 days or 2 weeks previously. So if when we identify something, testing positive for COVID leads to isolating for 2 weeks, 10 days. What is the implication of that? So what that means is, what happens because you have to isolate? I'm not asking you to have an example of what isolation means. What happens because you have to isolate? Well, because you have to isolate, it means that you can't go to school and be in the classroom. So that is the implication of it. That's what happens because you've got to isolate. Then you give the impact. Well, what is the impact of you not being in school? Well, as a result, you're not able to speak to your teacher to ask them for clarification if you're unsure about something. The impact of it is that you're not able to maybe do some of the practical hands-on work that your classmates are doing because you're not in the class. Again, because you're not allowed to go to school. And the reason you're not allowed to go to school is because you're having to isolate. So through that answer, there's a link. It follows on from each other. So you have to isolate. Implication of that, you can't go to school. Impact of not being able to go to school is to do with the impact it has on your learning. Now, you're not going to get asked to analyse the impact of COVID in your higher PE exam, but just thinking through the answer structure like that hopefully helps it make sense. So here's a past paper question. Analyse the method or methods, you could talk about multiple, you could use to record the development of physical factors that impact on performance. So here's an example of an answer that you could write for this. A training diary can be kept as a permanent record. What is the implication of being able to keep a training diary as a permanent record? What happens because you're able to do that? Well, this meant that I could easily look back at my previous training diary entries to check for improvements in my level of CRE. That's the implication of being able to keep training diary as a permanent record. Now, what is the impact of being able to look back at these previous entries? Well, the impact of that is, as a result, I was able to see when I had to make my training more challenging so that I would continue to make improvements and to stop my development from plateauing. That's the impact of being able to check for improvements by looking back at previous training diary entries, and the whole way that you're able to do that is because the training diary can be kept as a permanent record. Here's an example of an answer. I would like you to have a look at this answer and check and change the answer. I would like you to write out the answer in the III structure, identify, implication, impact. Also, I need you to decide if there's any further detail that you think is required in this answer. Do you think this answer is sufficient to get a mark for an analysed answer? And if it's not, then you need to go and make a change to it to make it I. So the answer so far is my training diary was personal to me, and I would write down my own opinions on how I had worked in the sessions. This meant that I sometimes would lie to suggest that I was finding the sessions easy. Pause the video just now and write that out as the I. So here is this answer written out in the I structure. In the last form it was in, I wouldn't say that it was sufficient to get a mark for an analysed answer. So there's a bit more detail that's had to be added in to this slide. My training diary was personal to me, and I would write down my own opinions on how I had worked in the sessions. Okay, so that's something about the training diary. You write down your own opinions on how you work during the sessions, so it's personal to you. What's the implication of that? Well, this meant that I would sometimes lie to suggest that I was finding the sessions easy to make myself feel better about my own ability. What is the impact of you writing down lies in your training diary? Well, this led to me progressing my training sessions to make them more difficult. However, I wasn't ready for this, and I then became demotivated in training sessions and wanted to give up as I didn't experience much success. So that is the impact of the fact that you would sometimes lie to make yourself feel better, and the reason you would lie is because you're the one that is your own opinions that are written down in the training diary. So that is an example of a possible answer that you could write for this question. I would like you to now pause the video again and write down 2 answers of your own for the following question. So in your own school you will have carried out a PDP, you'll have recorded your development for the physical factors probably, and so I would like you to write it down for you. So pause the video now and write down 2 answers. So now I want you to go back and check and change your own answers. So in the identify bit of your answer, have you picked out a part of the process or of the method that you have used to record the development? Have you picked out a part of it? Have you then gone on and said the implication of whatever it is that you have picked out? Have you then given the impact that that has? When you're writing your answers, I sometimes find it beneficial to start each part of the answer with certain words. So when you're given the context and the evidence for the explain questions, I think it's sometimes good to write "for example," because that encourages you to give an example. Whereas for the analyse questions, because it's the implication and then the impact that you have to give, I think using phrases such as "this means that," "as a result," "therefore," "this is what happens," that helps you to make sure it is implication and impact that you're given and not just examples. So hopefully you've managed to write 2 answers for that question. We're now going to move on to the final command word, the evaluate command word, and it's the final acronym of today. IJV. Identify, judgment and value. So the identify bit of the answer, again, just like the analyse, just like the P and the point for an explain question, this is when you pick out a part of what you're going to talk about. So if you're evaluating an approach, you would pick out part of the approach that you're going to talk about. You then go on and give a judgment on something. When you give a judgment on something, a judgment can be positive or negative. And you might use some phrases like, it was effective, ineffective, it was good, it was bad. And then you'll finish off your evaluation by giving the value of something. And that is you concluding by giving the explanation of the impact or the effectiveness and kind of what the value is that has. So when you're evaluating something, it's all about making a judgment on it. Many of you will have evaluated things out with PE and just in everyday life. So, for example, if you've been on holiday, if you've been on a flight, at the end you might complete a customer service survey to evaluate the customer service that you have received, and that's when you will provide a judgment on your thoughts on how good or effective the service was that you received. So that is what we're having to do within higher PE when we're asked to evaluate. We don't evaluate a holiday, we don't evaluate a flight, but we evaluate whatever it is that we have been asked to evaluate in relation to higher PE. So here's an example of an evaluate question. Evaluate the effectiveness of the approach described in part A, which was approaches for the physical factor, on performance. So again, just giving an example of what an answer would look like for this question. The identify bit. The condition game had a change to scoring. We've got 2 points for a winner and 1 point for an out of court, so for a shot that went out of the court if on the particular skill that you were trying. So that's the part of the approach that we are picking out to evaluate. We're picked out the change in the scoring of the condition game. We now need to provide a judgment on that. So what is a judgment on that? Well, this was useful, as I felt I was encouraged to spike more in the condition game, as I knew even hitting it out I would still get a point, so I used it lots. So that's you giving a judgment on kind of if you thought it was good or not. We're saying it's useful because you were encouraged to spike more because there was still points even if the ball went out. What is the value of that? Well, this helped in matches as I was looking to spike the ball more frequently, as we were constantly setting up attacks that were challenging for the opponent to return. Now, in the value part for this question, it is important that it relates to performance. And the reason that is because in the question, it clearly states on performance. However, if you were just being asked to evaluate the effectiveness of an approach, your value wouldn't necessarily have to relate to the actual game performance. It would just have to give you a value in general, and that might be related to performance. It might just be related to using that approach in the PDP. But the value for this question must be in relation to actual performance. I would like you to go ahead and complete this answer. So the condition game was set up so that my opponent would play an appropriate serve to my area of development. So imagine, for example, you're working on improving your overhead clear in badminton. The condition that may be on the game is each point must start with a high serve. Is that good? Well, this was good as we always got a good feed to enable me to play my shot that needs to be developed. You could be even more specific and say the shot there. Right, what is the value of that? Why was that good? Why is that going to help the performance? I want you to pause the video and complete that answer. And now, using what we've just gone over there on this question, I would like you to evaluate the effectiveness of an approach for the physical factor. The previous two answers that we've looked at have been on condition games, but you can use an approach of your choice that you have used for the physical factor and evaluate its effectiveness. Create two answers and use the IJV answer structure. And go back and look at the example answer to make sure that you're hitting the key points. Make sure that in that judgment section you provide your judgment. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it effective? Is it ineffective? Is it useful? Is it not useful? And then what is the actual value? So pause the video and complete those two answers. Thanks a lot for taking the time to watch this video. I really do hope that it's been beneficial for you. And if we go back to what we set out to do in this video, we were hoping to develop your understanding of the command words that are used within higher PE to allow you to be more confident when answering a question. So I hope that you can now identify the command word that's within the question and select the appropriate answer structure to use to answer the question. Throughout the video, we've had lots of tasks where you've had to pause, complete answers, write your own answers to apply your understanding of the answer structures. Now, hopefully, you are becoming more and more confident and comfortable with doing that. So what you now need to do is spend time answering past paper questions for all of the command words. You don't know what command words are going to come up in the final exam, so you need to be prepared for them all. But I also want you to spend a bit of time identifying the command word that you feel less confident with and focus on them. So for example, if it is the analyse and evaluate questions or explain, describe, whatever ones it is you're finding a little bit more challenging, make sure you spend time on that, go and find past paper questions on them and go through the process over and over again. That's how you'll get better at it. Go back to the section of the video where we go through that, and there's example answers there. So you have the example answer, work on a question, compare your answer to the example answer, and go from there. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope you found it useful, and good luck for the final exam when it comes around.